All right, let's talk about testing layout. So last week we talked a little bit about testing layout. We discussed snapshot testing, right, where basically we generated the HTML that we wanted to expect, and then compared that expected HTML with the actual HTML as the user interface responded to certain inputs, certain events, right? And if it didn't match, right, we wanted the test to notify us that something went wrong, something has changed, and the HTML is no longer valid. So let's revisit that a little bit, and try to break it up into some of the various concerns or the various strategies that we have that we would need to effectively validate this, right? So one of the issues is that we need to be able to put the application or the component in a particular state, right? So that we know that it's in a particular state, right? We know that maybe it's an account balance, right? That we need to say that we know that the balance is $100, and that if we deposit $5, we would expect the balance to go to 105. Right? But we need to know what the state is, right? We need to know what the input is so that we can then compare it against the right behavior. Right? So we need to be able to mock the data so that we can put the application in the correct state. The other one is that as the application, as the component reacts to the various events, right, of adding new content or removing content, we want to make sure that the DOM that the component would generate is indeed behaving the way we expect, right? If we give it a state where it needs to render two users in a list, we want to make sure that we could look at the DOM and check to see, are the two elements actually there? We'd like to be able to retrieve the DOM and say, does the DOM actually contain two rows or two line items or whatever? Right? We need to be able to programmatically look at this and say, is it working? Right? Or if it's some mathematical or some computation algorithm that some calculated content, we'd like to be able to say, well, here's the initial input, initial data, mock data. Here's the stimuli. Does the DOM represent what the expected DOM is, right? Also, we'd like to be able to programmatically interact with the DOM. We'd like to be able to generate all sorts of events, clicking and dragging and typing and all sorts of interaction with the DOM programmatically, trying to replace the user. The user, we want to automate this. We don't want an actual user, doing this. And finally, we'd like to be able to validate the DOM against something that we would be expecting. So let's consider some mock data. For instance, here's a couple of quotes that contained a couple of some description, a price that was being quoted, the title, that the name of the quote, and some IDs 1 and 2, and we've stored it in some JSON file, right? So typically, whatever data that you might be using to mock, to put the component in a particular state, it's typically a good idea to have a separate file that you can edit, maybe with a JSON editor, right? So that you know exactly what your application, the data that you're expecting. This is typically data that you would be fetching from a remote server, right? From a remote service. Again, we're going to mock that. So instead of going out to some remote service, we have it locally for our tests, right? And you would put it perhaps in a known location, such as source data. So let's try and implement an actual test. So we're going to load the actual component that is under test, which is our quotes component. Right? This is the one that summarizes a list of quotes, iterates over a list of quotes and generates, I forget if it's a table or a list, line item, I forget. Notice that we're loading the mocked data, right? The quotes.mock JSON. We also are loading from the React test renderer, right? That's the mechanism that allows us to programmatically render this in memory, as opposed to that allows us to decouple from the browser, right? So we can render things in memory without the need of an actual browser. Okay, it generates the DOM that our component would generate without the need of having an actual browser. So here's a test, and we're going to call it, that the quote list, the list of quotes renders correctly. Right? That's the name of the test, and the implementation. Oops. Why is it not rendering correctly? Okay. So what we looked at last week, we looked at, for instance, using snapshot testing. Right? We would instantiate the component, and right, with using the dot create, and then using the actual HTML elements to render the component. We're passing it the state. Notice that because now this is functional, because our quote is now a stateless component. See this? Because this is stateless, we can now pass in the data, right? Without having the quote actually going fetch anything to some remote server. We can totally control what the input data of this component is, right? Without having to deal with the component having to fetch anything, right? We've removed that dependency. Here's just an example of using snapshot testing. I'm not going to cover that again. We covered that in last week. Instead, let's focus on a couple of other things. Right? Now, the HTML that renders this component has been enhanced in such a way that the elements that we want to verify have been, we've added classes. We've added strategic classes on the components that we want to verify. We want to check to see, are the delete buttons, if we're rendering two items where there should be 2 delete buttons, right? And there should be 2 select buttons. There should be 1 input field to update. There should be a create button. There should be an update button, right? So to verify that the DOM is rendering correctly, what we've done is that we've added classes to all these elements, yes? So that when they dynamically render in the DOM, we can then go find them in the DOM and check to see if indeed they are in the DOM, right? So for instance, what we've done here is that we're using the tree, right? This tree over here, this tree, right? And we're using it to instantiate oh, I don't have the test instance. How do we get hold of the test instance? I skipped that line. There's one line here missing, right? I'll add it in a minute. That gives us access to the test instance, right? The test instance is built from that tree, the tree we built earlier, and which gives us an API that allows us to go into the DOM, right, into the generated DOM, and query it. And we can say, hey, return to me, go fetch me all the elements that have this particular class, right, that have job dash title dash field. Go and fetch me any elements that has this particular class name, create quote buttons. Go fetch me all the update buttons, right? Because there should be just one update button. Yes, there should be only one update button. One update button, one create quote button. There should be one title field. For the rows, right? Because there were 2 quotes, there should be 2 rows that were rendered. We can go and fetch them, right? We have strategically tagged all the quotes, all the rows with quote dash row, right? So that when they come back, we know we can check to see that there's 2 of these. There's 1 job title, there's 2 delete buttons, and there's 2 select buttons. Right? We've gone to the DOM and fetched all these, and we can then create all sorts of asserts and say, and we can do some expects and say, well, there should be that field, that initial field, because the quote, right, we fed it with quote sub 0, has a job title of J1, right? We can later on just go retrieve it and make sure that the job title is indeed job 1. Okay? So, did the form successfully update? Right? Did the input actually say job 1? Because I fed it the initial job. Also, is there actually just one create button length? Is it one? Is there only one button of these? Is it only one update button? Are there actually 2 rows? Are there actually 2 job titles? Are there actually 2 delete buttons? Are there actually 2 select buttons? Right. So we can go down to the DOM and verify all these things. Yes, and we can even go further and generate events, which would add a new quote, say, right, and check to see that the row is correct. Right. Also, the row might be some complex computation. Maybe the quotation maybe it's an estimate, right? And the estimate would give an estimate on the user interface and say, with all these constraints, with being an emergency and it's on the weekends and you want me to come in just once, then the quote is $1,000, right? So it could be a complex algorithm that calculates some value that then is referenced in the user interface. You want to verify that is updating correctly. Make sense? All right.